Well, welcome to this webinar. I'm very pleased that you're able to join us. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome. This is the last in our Askia spring webinar series. And we've had some interesting sessions. I think some of you have been to many of you. I think one or two have actually been to all five. So big rewards to those who've been with us for all five. So today we're going to be talking with Tim Brandwood. He sat opposite me in our London office at Askia Towers. Tim is the CEO of Digital Taxonomy. Many of you will know Digital Taxonomy already. So they're a company that's really formed to really take and harness, the whole combined power of artificial intelligence, but alongside human judgment to transform unstructured text into insights. And we'll be looking at some of the techniques that Digital Taxonomy use with the Codeit product. I'm going to hand over to Tim in a second. In terms of the way we're going to handle chat in this session, we're going to do that. There's a chat feature, so if you've got questions, whenever you like, please do use the chat facility. There's an arrow pointing to which of the menu items it is. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tim. There'll be a short pause as I stop sharing these slides.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And thanks for inviting us to speak again at your spring webinar series. Yeah, we were here last year. It's very hard to believe it was a whole year ago. Time seems to have flown by. And so we've been obviously very busy working on lots and lots of things to do with all things coding, all things text, all things Codeit. Now it's going to be impossible in the 20-25 minutes that we've got today to condense all of that and cover all of that. And I think all of you guys watching today probably wouldn't thank me if I tried. So what we decided to do today is just to run through a few of the more interesting things that we've been working on recently, and things that have direct relevance to Askia users specifically, and just cover off some of those, just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the new and interesting stuff that we're working on. There's every chance that, in fact, putting this together, it made me realise how much stuff we've had to leave out. So there's a good chance that we'll be running some of our own webinars fairly soon, just to cover off some of the other areas that we're working on. But with that, I'll just do a very quick explanation of what Codeit is, because I appreciate not everyone on this call will know that, but I appreciate that the majority of people do. So this is just going to be a very high level explanation of what Codeit is and what it does. As Richard mentioned in the introduction there, Codeit is all about working with unstructured text, and in a survey setting, that typically means verbatim responses from open-ended questions. So we should all be fairly familiar with the world of coding, where we categorise verbatims against the code frame, so that they can be analysed quantitatively post-field work. And so here you're just seeing the main Codeit screen that coders can use to apply codes to verbatims, so that they can be categorised and aggregated. And so that should all be fairly obvious and self-explanatory to people who've seen coding before. The difference with Codeit as compared to say the Askia's existing coding tool or coding in Excel, for example, is that what we try and do is blend a mixture of human input. So in the case of coding verbatim mode, and then that's people just doing coding, and we combine that with some cutting-edge artificial intelligence and also text analytics to make the process faster, smoother, and just a whole lot more efficient, while still maintaining the levels of quality that are required within a market research setting. So at a very high level, that's what Codeit's about. It's about taking sexy, cutting-edge technology, blending it with good old-fashioned human judgment and getting the job done really efficiently and quickly. So hopefully that's enough for people who've never seen Codeit before to get the general idea. And so hopefully, if we can squeeze it in, there's 4 new features, 4 new things that I want to talk about today that we've been working on. The first of which is something we've been calling adaptive surveys. I'm not 100% sure if this is a standard industry term or whether I've just made it up or what, I don't know. But regardless of the terminology, definitely we've seen in recent times people interested in being able to route a questionnaire off an open-ended question. So ask somebody an open-ended question in a survey, and then depending on what they say, ask them a follow-up question, or route the questionnaire in a certain direction. And that's very difficult with open-ended questions because people have multiple different ways that they could express the same thing. I mean, if you're getting single-word answers back, maybe it wouldn't be so difficult. You could do that in just normal Askia script. But things get a bit complicated when you allow people to express things in their own words. So to sort of bring this idea to life, let's take this fictitious theme park example that we've got here. This is a theme park that runs a customer satisfaction survey, and they want to, there's a couple of key themes that they're interested in following up on. So the first question asks, what could they do to improve the next visit to the theme park? And what they want to do is, if anybody mentions anything to do with queuing, we want to find out if the respondent is complaining about queuing, but they had a fast track, which for legal reasons we're calling queue buster wristband, because obviously there's a difference between people who are complaining about queuing who paid for a fast track wristband versus those who didn't. And then on the food side, if people say that they'd like to see a better range of food options, then we want to ask them a follow-up question to say, well, okay, what kind of food options? I mean, it's great that you're telling us this, but we want to know kind of what kind of food options would you prefer to see. And this is often the case with open-ended questions in surveys. You ask a question and you can't respond to what's being said because there's just no mechanism to do it. And often the trail goes cold, if you like. Now, if you think back to the old days of CATI, you could train interviewers to probe, to follow up, to perhaps ask a bit more detail. And obviously, with the move to web interviewing, some of that's been lost. So, what we're trying to do here is try and find some sort of middle ground between the two, so that if certain things come up, then we can sort of get, even within a web interview, we can do a bit of following up and probing that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So in this case, we want to ask what kind of food options they would prefer to see. And then if they mention anything to do with vegan or vegetarianism, we want to ask whether or not they were aware of the meatless menu that was available in the cafe. So the theme park does offer vegetarian options. It may be that people just weren't aware and it's not been promoted properly.
Yep.
So that's the structure we're trying to achieve. Now, if I switch over to design here, you can see we set up an example survey which is structured exactly along these lines. So the first question pops up saying, what could we do to improve your next visit to Thorpe Towers? I'm going to say less waiting time. Okay. And then when I move on to the next question, I then get asked the question about the queue buster wristband, okay, which is what we want. I'm just going to go back and actually change my answer and say, well, actually, no, I'd like to see a better range of food, okay. And then when I move on, I'll get asked what food options would I prefer to see, and here I'm going to say more vegan options, okay, and then likewise, I get asked the awareness of the vegetarian menu question. I can also go a step further and at the first question answer both actually and say better range of food and less waiting time. And bear in mind here, this is the phrasing I'm using, but obviously we'll see how it works in a minute. the way Codeit can interpret the text that we're giving it here, it's not literally just these words that it will pick up on. If people express exactly the same idea but in lots of different ways, we'll still be able to derive the meaning from it and do the routing correctly. So if I now press next, I'll get asked the QBuster question, and then I will get asked the question about the food options that I prefer to see, and so on. So quite sophisticated routing, but quite easily achieved using design. So how have we done this? Okay, so just to take a very high level sort of technical view, it's essentially working like this. The respondent gives us the open response in the survey, and that response is then sent by Askia back to WebProd, and then CCA will then route that open-ended response onto the Codeit API, Codeit REST API, and then in response to that, Codeit will send back the codes that it thinks that particular verbatim should be coded as, and then the routing, which is represented by those arrows up there, the routing within the Askia KES file is then activated, and then the relevant follow-up questions are then asked according to the routing logic that's defined in the questionnaire. Okay, so that's sort of at a high level how it works. Obviously, for all you Askia users, you're probably interested to see exactly how that's set up within design. I'm just going to give you a very sort of quick glimpse of that, just so you can sort of get the idea. We have, and this is a relatively new feature within Askia, we have a routing action which is specifically designed for this kind of purpose. Okay, so once question 1, which is the improvements question, is asked, then this routing kicks in and it queries a web service. Now, in this case, the web service is the Codeit API, and we pass in the response that was given from question 1, which is then passed over to the Codeit API for it to then make suggestions for how that should be coded. And then when the response comes back from the Codeit API, there's some Askia script here, which I'm not going to go into in mega detail, but essentially that's interpreting the result that's come back from Codeit, and then it's using that to set the values in a closed question, Q1C. So over here in Q1C we have, let's switch back to question mode, Q1C is a closed question with these two queuing and food options defined in there. And then so we have a routing after QC, which then asks the relevant follow-up questions depending on the codes that have been applied. So that's just a very high-level glimpse of sort of how that works. This isn't intended to be a full-blown training session. So if this technique is of interest to you, then by all means get in touch with us, and we can sort of explain how that works in more detail, or give you this example, or whatever you want. Okay, so that's adaptive surveys covered. We think that's quite an interesting technique. It certainly opens up open-ended questions as a sort of different technique, and maybe allows routing and creative use of routing in questionnaires that perhaps wasn't possible before. And it's a great use of the new routing action that's been added to design.
Yeah, we've had a request in for the KEX.
Okay.
So yes, we can provide that.
I should say the script that I was just showing you there on screen there, that is pretty much the same script you would use every single time. So once you've actually got that script, you can just cut and paste that wherever you want. So in terms of setting it up, the first time you do it, you have to kind of do a little bit of trial and error, and you can copy our example. But once you've done it once, it's really easy after that, So. And
if there is a sort of miscode, what would happen then? What could be the scenario then?
So one thing I should point out, which I didn't mention earlier is within this script here. So the suggestions that come back from Codeit each have a confidence score attached to them.
Okay.
So Codeit will come back and say, I think this should be coded as queuing time with a confidence score of 100%, say, right? And so you'll see within the script here, we are checking that confidence score, and we're actually only routing off
confidence.
level. I mean, it's up to you where you set that level of confidence. But we've said in this example, anything over 75%, that's strong enough. That's strong enough to go with. And so, if you set the confidence level fairly high, a miscode is more likely going to be just something you don't ask when you could have done. So it's a missed opportunity it's much more likely to be a missed opportunity rather than asking somebody a completely irrelevant question because we've got it completely mixed up. See what I mean? But so that's that basically.
Okay. That's great. We've been looking for that for years.
Yeah. Well, the day has finally arrived. Okay, the next thing I want to touch on is a feature we've added to Codeit for auto-translation. And this is something that comes up time and time again from all quarters, where people have to deal with data collected in multiple languages, and then it needs to be coded. But maybe they don't, maybe people don't have a native speaker for every single language. And so, one option is, you can get a translation agency to translate the verbatims and then code them. That's totally fine. If you still want to do that in Codeit, that's fine. But increasingly, we've found that actually people aren't necessarily going to use the verbatims as deliverables for clients. They just want to code the verbatims, and so as long as enough of the meaning of the verbatim is preserved, people are happy to accept an auto-translated verbatim, because the level of, for the purposes of coding, that's a good enough quality. And so the main sort of use case that we seem to be getting asked for, and the way most people seem to want to handle this, is to use just a single common base language and employ coders who speak that base language and just code in one single language. And 99.9% of the time, that language seems to be English. So we've structured this so that you can import. I think we support just over 50 different languages currently, including Chinese and all sorts of other exotic languages. And so when you import the data, we can code that data. We translate that data automatically into English, and so then your coders can come in and just code in English or in the native language. I'll show you how that works in a second. So. The process is really, really easy. When you import your data into Codeit, you can just select which language you're importing and then which fields need to be auto-translated, and that's it, basically. As long as you've given Codeit that information, that's all it needs to do the translation. And then when coders come in to work on the data and code the data, they can choose which language they want to code in. So they can still code in the native language. There's nothing stopping people, French speakers, from coding in French. That's totally fine. Or if you pick English, then you see the auto-translated verbatims, and you can code off them. And so here's an example here, and you have to sort of take my word for it, that these were French verbatims when they went in, and they appear on screen in English for coders to code. And on the right-hand side, sort of next to each icon, next to each verbatim, is a little sort of globe icon that illustrates that verbatim has been translated, so it's from another language. So that's just a really useful feature that I think could potentially save people an awful lot of time, because it can cause quite a lot of delay, having to wait for all of the fieldwork to be finished, then the data to be translated, and then be coded, and it sort of cuts out one source of drag within the whole research process.
And did you say what's actually doing the translation?
We dabbled with both the Bing and Google APIs, and we found that Bing gave us, we thought, the better results over the Google API, interestingly. There's some languages that Google supports that Bing doesn't, so we may well be sort of mixing APIs actually and to try and get a broader coverage of languages. But for now, we've just gone with the Bing API, and works really, really well.
We've got a question in. How high is the confidence level for the translated verbatim across the board?
That's a good question. I don't think we put a number on, so we don't have a confidence score attached to verbatims. We translate, so we use the Bing API. It gives us back.
So it doesn't have its own confidence score.
Now I'm saying that, I have a funny feeling it might do. You know, I'm going to have to look into that one. Okay. That's a good one. Because if it is giving us that back, we should be making use of that. That could be useful information.
And can you ever get back to the original?
So in that previous screen here, you can go in and see the verbatims in their native form. It would be quite nice in this UI to be able to press something and or maybe even display them side by side. Yeah. So yeah, there's some extra stuff we could add in there to make that work. Okay. That sounds quite good. Okay, so that's sort of translation done. Now we're going to get very Askia specific now. So we're going to talk about the way that data is automatically synced between Askia and Codeit. So one thing we've worked quite hard on over the last year is a system that can automatically synchronize data from Askia into Codeit and back again in exactly the same way that Codeit does currently, and save. Askia uses the hassle of importing and exporting and merging and all of that sort of stuff. So the way that works, and again, for non-Askia users, this may not mean that much to you, but Askia has a system of coding groups which define which questions should be coded and how they should be written back to Askia. And so we've written a mechanism which we call the Askia Codeit bridge, which sort of piggybacks off that coding group mechanism to read and write data in and out of Codeit. Now, the challenge with that for some clients is that they can end up having to create huge numbers of coding groups, right? So that in itself becomes a bit of work. So what we've been doing is creating something that we've called data links, which is a way of rather than having to do all the configuration in Supervisor, you do the configuration within Codeit itself. So we've got a nice simple wizard here. Increasingly, a lot of the stuff that happens in Codeit is becoming just more wizard driven. I think what's starting to shake out now is a nice consistent user experience where all the actions sort of have the same sort of look and feel, which is good. And to do to sort of work through the process of linking to a questionnaire. I'm going to go quite quickly through this. You choose your survey, so that's a survey that's pulled from Askia. So which survey in Askia am I connecting to? You pick your source questions, pick your target questions, pick your context questions. So I picked age here. And something that's relatively new, you can pick a wave variable as well. So if you're actually running a tracking survey and you've got multiple waves within one questionnaire, you can pick out a question which denotes how to slice the data or carve up the data by wave. You then map your source questions to your target questions, specify which context variables to use where, and then you're done. And here we can see the data's been imported in, and it's been split by wave because I happened to pick that wave variable along the way through the wizard. So that makes it nice and simple to link Codeit to an Askia survey. And crucially, I only set up one task there. I only set up one question for coding, but I could have set up 20 all in one go. And so it's a very efficient way of just setting everything up in one batch rather than having to kind of do them one by one, which is what you have to do in Supervisor currently.
Okay.
And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the management reporting that we're building into Codeit. This screenshot here is just me inside the admin section of Codeit. And what we've built is the ability to sort of download all of our sort of stats data. So that's information about who's coded what, when data was uploaded, how quick the different coders work, who's the most productive, and so on. And download that into a format that will work with business intelligence tools, so Power BI, Tableau, so on and so forth. So it's sort of ready set up to pull into a BI tool for reporting. And then sort of to help with that process, we've created a Power BI template which will work with this downloaded data. So you can kind of point this template at the data and then just visualize how your project's going in Codeit. So this is a way of, supervisors or project managers or researchers just keeping tabs on how things are progressing. This particular screen shows in red data being uploaded. So the little red bars are chunks of data being loaded into Codeit by time, and the green bits represent items, verbatims that are being coded, and then the green and red lines are cumulative. So we can see that data is being uploaded, and the coders are keeping up with it in real time. And more recently, there's some data sort of waiting to be coded in this example. So we've got 399 items in the system and 254 coded. So there's a bit of catching up to be done there. So it's a nice visual way of just seeing when the interviews are coming in and how well you're keeping up with the coding. And then lastly, we provide pages that allow you to see how productive each of your coders are being, either by day or as a sort of overall by month. And so over here we can see that Fred and Mary, they're sort of coding about just over 100 verbatims an hour, so they're probably about even in terms of their productivity. And so, that's not necessarily important to everybody, but where you're running a big coding department and you maybe pay coders depending on productivity, it's really useful to know that those stats are in there and accessible in a nice sort of digestible form in Codeit.
And is Power BI, is there a free version, or is it a cost involved in having Power BI?
So one of the reasons we've gone with Power BI is because you can start using it for free.
Okay.
And when you're using our template, it's just really easy. The learning curve is very, very shallow. You just point the template at the data and away you go. Where things charges start to kick in when you want to start sharing dashboards, across the organisation, and Microsoft charge for that kind of thing. But in terms of just a supervisor just viewing the data and just seeing how things are going, that's all just totally free.
Okay.
I should say that if Tableau is your particular BI tool of choice, then our sort of download data format will work just as well, I think, with Tableau, but we haven't done a template for that yet.
Let's get into Iris. That's what you need to get into.
That's next on the list.
Okay. Anything else for us?
That's it. That's just some a whole collection of just things that we've been working on lately.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. We obviously have some time now for questions. So if there's any questions out there that we haven't had so far, please do use the chat function and we'll get them in. I did have one question. So adaptive surveys, going back to those.
Yep.
So could they work in a CATI environment, or is it just web?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that one of the advantages of adaptive surveys is that they can provide that level of probing in a web environment. But obviously the way Askia is designed and the way design works is that those routing instructions are exactly the same, regardless of whether you're in CATI or web. So in a CATI environment, the interviewer would enter the verbatim, and the routing would just route off that text just the same as if the respondent had added it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And we have a question in. Yeah, so could it work for voice recording? So then you'd need some kind of a transcription.
Yeah, good question. And so in real time, yeah, you're absolutely right. You would need some sort of voice to text mechanism.
Which are...
I don't know how far...
the company Myforce have Bison, which does some of that.
Okay, so in theory, I mean that would be a fascinating...
So to link
Bison
with Codeit.
So Bison to CCA to Codeit and back again. That's in theory doable, definitely. Yep. That'd be great fun to have a go at that.
Yep. Another question. What if the responses don't fit into a pre-supplied frame? So I guess if someone's put in an answer that's kind of left field.
Yeah. So I mean, Codeit is designed to sort of designed around predefined code frames. So what you're asking when you give Codeit API a verbatim, you're asking Codeit to say, out of all the codes that you know about, which ones do you think this one applies to? Now that said, if so within that mechanism, it can't magically sort of know about a new concept that it's never come across before. That said, we do have I haven't talked about it today, but we have our text analytics engine exposed also through the Askia API. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason why you couldn't send the verbatim to that at the same time, and see whether things are coming back from the text analytics that weren't detected by the normal sort of coding API. Text analytics also will give you back levels of sentiment as well. So that can tell you how angry a person is, or how deliriously happy they are, or whatever. So there's an option there to tap into the text analytics. And you could also put your if all else fails and the respondent says something that is completely off the radar, well then you'll know in your Askia script that nothing.
Do nothing.
Yeah, you can either do nothing, or well they're obviously talking about something else. You could even ask just a follow-up question, say, oh, that's very interesting. Please give us some more details about that.
And is this something people could sort of play with for a bit?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. So we can make Codeit available to new potential customers on a trial basis, and we can help give you access to the API, give you instructions on how to try that out. That's a very good way of actually getting familiar with it. Actually, is just to put in your own sort of test data, do your own sort of setup. It's the same sort of way I've done there, just to do a sort of dummy example and get a feel for yourself of how it works.
Good. I think that's the end of the questions we've had in live. So unless there's any more, I think we're going to close this session. It has been recorded. I'm going to send out the recording. But thank you very much for your attention and for joining us, and thank you, Tim.
No problem.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.